Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, welcome everyone to episode 24 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I am really excited to pick up the conversation today because we're building off of the last couple of weeks. So if you've been listening, you know that Melissa and I chunked our last couple of episodes from a previous recorded episode on using your voice. And certainly you, having listened to that, you understand the timing of that. And strategically, we want to then continue the conversation today. In our world right now, it's October 14th. You'll probably hear this several days after this recording. But we want to focus now on this idea of informing your voice. So we talked about using your voice. Now we want to talk about informing your voice. And so I'm joined today by the fabulous Melissa. Melissa, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing just great. Appreciate that. And the two of us are joined by someone who, if you're listening to every episode, and Melissa, I have no way of knowing if people are listening to every episode, but if they're not, they're going to be brand new to Henri Williams. But if they are, exactly, they're missing out and they're going to go back. But we're joined by our friend Henri Williams, who's going to spend a little bit of time with us today, too, talking about this idea of informing your voice, because that in and of itself is going to make it more powerful. How are you today, Henri?
Oh, great, and happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. You guys, we won't go too much into this because we want to be really efficient with our time, but in our world right now, it's a Wednesday afternoon. We've all had a long week. Melissa started our conversation off record and said, it's Wednesday, but it feels like Thursday and I need it to be Friday. And I said, that about sums it up. Like that's about it. But we really wanted to record this conversation today because you guys are voting, like right now, right? I think this morning the most recent estimate I heard was 10 million people have already submitted. I think that's the right number. Don't fact check me. I could be wrong, but millions of people have already voted, right? Millions, right? That's the safe number. So that's happening already, and it occurred to us in some informal conversations recently that we're spending a lot of time talking about the presidential election right now, and presidential election, super important. Everybody go out and vote and make a difference in an election. But we've also been talking about the fact that as important as that is, if we ignore what's happening locally and at the state level in our world, and we don't inform ourselves about those elections, then we could actually not really go a long way in solving much of anything that has to do with our day-to-day lives. So today what we want to do is spend some time talking about, first, why we vote, and then from there, how we arm that vote or inform that vote, right? What are the resources you have at hand to inform that vote? So to start us off, Henri, I'm going to come to you first, because in our pre-planning conversation that happened about 5 seconds ago, Henri was really beautifully talked about this idea of why we vote in terms of the racial unrest that we have experienced as a country for generations, but certainly most recently in a really hyper focused way. So Henri, talk a little bit about this idea of from protests to elections, if you would, to start us off.
Oh, well, thank you. I guess the whole idea came about, of course, as we are all enthused and thinking about this national election. And as you're hearing, millions of people have already voted. We're seeing people literally standing on line for hours in some places because it is literally that important to them. And I started to think about something we said in an earlier podcast, the difference between a moment and a movement, talking about sacrifice.
Yep.
And that kind of led to how do we sustain the energy? Because, we'll get through this national election, and ideally there'll be an outcome that will be favorable to most of us Americans.
Sure.
But what happens after that?
Yeah.
And, when you start to think about elections and the let's just say in a more global way, this has to do a lot with your day-to-day existence.
Yeah.
And so, not to lose this thought, I started to then segue with, all right, we're also going through this social unrest,
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter, these police shootings, and these grand juries of making decisions around whether we should hold police accountable or not. And I'm quite sure many people have been surprised by, at least in the Breonna Taylor outcome, that we now learn the prosecutors never even presented the police as an option for prosecution or indictment. And what's interesting about this is these folks, these judges, these prosecutors, they're elected officials. And so, yeah, we protest and we want change. And even in the moment, if we had a favorable outcome, if we didn't vote and change the officials, the people who are making these local decisions about our day-to-day decisions, and these things continue to happen.
Yeah.
And this goes on beyond the presidential election. This often happens in all years. I mean, we know every 4 years is a presidential election, but states and locally, and I would say almost every year, depending on where you live, there could be an election for, a governor, a mayor, town supervisors. And again, when we think about this on the local level, the things that affect us day to day, our lives. It is so important to really be engaged and think about voting and participation beyond the every 4 years when there's a presidential election.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the data bears that out. When we look at the data, we generally see, there's this uptick every 4 years. I mean, even in the off election, every 2 years when we decide on the House and some Senate races, we still don't see the turnout that we see in that every 4 years in the presidential election. And it's just so fascinating to me, the things that just get lost in not doing that. I mean, every state has a similar construct as the federal government called a legislature or an assembly where there's maybe a House and a Senate version. They make decisions and laws about things that affect you every day.
Yeah.
These are voted officials.
That's so significant. I appreciate you starting us off right there, Henri, because that's really where we want to spend our conversation today is, again, acknowledging the huge importance of the presidential election this year, but really starting to think in terms of when you think about the things that we were on the streets protesting about from May, in some places up until right now, and a lot of places it's kind of, as you said, kind of just petered off, if you will. Those are things that are mostly controlled at the local level, right? And so how we start to think about translating that energy we're putting into that, the idea of protesting as an example, into taking action through this election process in order to ensure that we start to see systemic change. Melissa, what are you thinking?
Well, I think it's, everything Henri said is absolutely right, but I don't think that many people make that connection, as we were saying earlier. A lot of people don't connect the dots, and I think a lot of that is because of where we get information from.
Sure.
A lot of us, still get information from the media, and I don't, not throwing up any, fake news kind of thing, but we're getting it from like social media. We're getting it from what our friends are saying and what our neighbors are saying, and even what we see on the news. But even on the news, it's the push for the president. We don't see around the clock coverage about elections until it's the national level. Yeah. And I get that it's because there's a national audience to these shows, so they can't hone down to each individual state. But they don't even really brush over it. Like there's really no coverage of other elections. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to take it upon ourselves to say, I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to, make this decision. I think we also wanted to at least discuss us for a little bit, not in depth, why people vote and why they don't vote.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a huge part of the conversation as well. While I do believe that a lot of it is disconnect, I know many people who are very well informed and just don't think their vote counts.
Yeah.
Through whether it's because it's an electoral college or, we've seen past presidents where the popular candidate who got the most votes still didn't win the election.
Sure.
And I think that it's left people a little disheartened and a little downtrodden. And so I think we have to acknowledge that and respect that and not just brush it off as, well, if you don't vote, you don't get to, complain like
about
that's
the
what
outcome.
You often hear. But but considering the circumstances, it's understandable why some people don't vote. Do I agree with it? Absolutely not. If for no other reason than my historical perspective, I'm voting because there are people who fought and died for me to have rights, which one of those rights is to not vote if I choose. But at the end of the day, I choose to. I think we have to acknowledge why so many people choose not to.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's tie that then, because Henri, when we were chatting briefly before we started recording today, you were telling us a story about a video that's gone viral that I haven't seen because that's how not tech savvy I am, right? By a rapper named Yellow Pain, and his video was about, I think you said it was titled My Vote Don't Count. And so Melissa just talked about, not some people not voting simply because they don't think that their voice will matter. But talk to us a little bit about the messaging from that really resonated with you.
Well, and again, what resonated with me, he actually did an interview with Joe Madison on Joe Madison's show this morning. And what resonated me is just what Melissa is saying, this idea of my vote doesn't count. And, the idea of the electoral college. And again, as I'm listening to you, Melissa, it's like, I was one of those at one point in my life, too. I don't know if I thought about my vote didn't count, but I never thought much about anything beyond the presidential election. And a lot of that is, and it wasn't through a lack of understanding how government worked. I mean, fortunately, I went to school at a time when they taught civics. But I just didn't pay attention until, like this rapper kind of was saying in his interview with Joe Madison, you start to look around you and you're thinking about the local things that are affecting you. Well, how come the garbage isn't getting picked up? Or how come certain neighborhoods get things that other neighborhoods don't get? Or how come services are being dispersed in certain ways, in our community? And it all boils down to, well, those are decisions that are made by your local elected officials, the trickle-down effect. And so you hopefully come to that aha moment of, this is about, regardless of who the president is, when the money trickles down to the local government, how it's distributed or appropriated has a lot to do with who's elected and who is in that office. And what did I do or not do to affect that? So I just want to go back to a thought. And again, this, I went through this, hopefully people will also go through this. Yes, the Electoral College does have an influence on the presidential election. But that's just the presidential election.
Yep.
I mean, that has no effect on the Senate,
that's exactly
the House,
right.
or any of the local elections. So, yes, your vote does count. When you start to look at the other elections, I was also struck by something you said earlier, Janice, and I also got my ballot in the mail. And so I'm going to open it up as we're speaking. And what's interesting about my ballot is I'm voting for the president, a Congress representative, and a state senator, a state assembly member, and town council. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. We have no propositions going on at the moment, although I probably would like some. My point being, as I listen to you, and I remember back to my days living in California, that's overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond the 10 propositions that you have to read through and understand, and Melissa, you're so right, because there were years ago, there was a proposition around LGBTQ that just the way it was worded, people found out that they voted contrary to how they really intended. And it was all about the wording of the proposition.
Yep.
But, I want to go back to, something I've been saying, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And the sacrifice is, yeah, this may be overwhelming, but maybe I'm going to have to sacrifice some time to do a little research.
That's it.
And really read up on what is the intent of the proposition. Who are these elected officials and what do they stand for? Depending on where you live, it's not always just, not to put it this way, black and white, there's a Republican and a Democrat running. In some of your local places, you have other party members running that are just as viable.
Yeah.
What do you know about?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I would even go so far as to say to research the positions that they hold, because a lot of people don't know what duties the mayor has and what impact the mayor may have on the rules and the regulations and the laws and the things that affect their everyday life. So if you're going to, and I hear you completely, Henri, in that it's a sacrifice of your time, but what better way to spend it?
Yes.
If we're spending time watching television or spending, and I know for myself, I can get lost on Facebook and before I know it, an hour and a half has gone by. If I'm going to spend that kind of time, why not spend it doing something that's going to actually impact my life? And the other thing you said that really resonated with me, and it's as crazy as this sounds, guys, because I'm almost 50, but I like watching TikTok videos because they keep me kind of young and in the loop with what my son's doing and all of that. But I came across one where a young man was saying, he was a white male, a young white male, and he said, I'm not voting for myself because the world is set up for me to succeed. I'm voting for the people I care about who don't have that advantage or privilege, which I know a lot of people don't like that term, but it is what it is. He was saying, so the people that I'm voting for are my friends of color, are my friends who are LGBTQ, whatever. He was saying that's the sacrifice I make with my vote. So I think that's something else that we don't think about is a lot of times we want to vote for what works for us. And that's great. But we also have to think about the big picture as well. And so that's why it's even more important to be informed about these propositions and things like that, because they may not impact you directly, but you want to make sure you're researching them and voting, the way that agrees with your spirit, if nothing else.
So I want to
the community and the people you value.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So let me press on a couple of things that both of you have said. So because I don't want to lose this strand, I want to make sure we just dig on it a little bit. Both of you are talking, we have a theme here. I think our listeners are probably catching on, right? About, it's important to vote every year. And we're focusing on this year right now because that's where people's attention span is. But to think in terms of all the different things you're going to vote for, or you are in the process of voting for right now, because they are the ones that tie back to your day to day. So you brought up, Henri, the grand jury records coming out for Breonna Taylor. And that's a really powerful national example of the fact that the people who were in control of those decisions are elected, right? Yeah. So we have a voice there. And that's a great example of a non-presidential election that impacts us day to day in a very powerful way. And picking up on what you said, Melissa, you talked about understanding the roles. And I love that you talked about that, right? What is the mayor responsible for, right? What is somebody on my town council responsible for? Here's a really great example of that. I just happened to coincidentally be reading an article today about systems change. And in it was giving, this was a random example, but it's such a great point to what you just said. In it was talking about a particular area here in California where they're trying to eradicate homelessness. And a particular agency has come in to try to do that work. And they're talking about the two levels of government that are engaged in that work. So you have the mayor and the city administration of this particular area in California, who control housing, right? But you also have the board of supervisors who control social services. And what this nonprofit was trying to do is they needed both of those things, right? They needed housing and they needed social services. Two local government agencies that do not have any reason to interact. There is no work that they do that requires them to interact. And so to your point about understanding the roles and understanding how does it work out for me, right? If I'm not well informed about who I choose for mayor, and I will be choosing a mayor coming up in a couple of weeks, then what is the impact of the person who's elected going to have on my day-to-day life versus somebody in my board of supervisors? So I don't want to go further than that because, again, we can get really in the weeds with it. But to your point about understanding the roles, right, that's a really important point. And now I want to bring it back to this idea of day-to-day, right? Because, Henri, you said this earlier, and you said it when we were chatting earlier, too, how little I think that we understand on a day-to-day basis how much of our day-to-day life is actually controlled by people who are elected. Right? Like, go ahead, Henri.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking of, what would be an example of this? And this is going back a ways. Remember Ferguson and Michael Brown?
Of course.
And so the prosecutor who brought no charges, what happened? He got voted out.
There you go.
And if my memory is correct, he was in his office for something like 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think they changed the mayor also.
Yep.
But this was a process of looking at what's going on locally.
Yep.
These officials were all elected officials.
Yeah.
And they changed it. And so I guess I'm just using it as an example to go back to my earlier point. We're in the throes of very similar situations across our nation. And let's not lose sight, if we're looking for the long-term solution, the things that, again, as you said, affect us locally, day to day, our policing. I'll give you another example. One of the things that has been resonating and we're talking about in the election is police reform.
Yeah.
And so to me, and some other things I've read, police reform isn't about taking away police,
nope.
defunding police, more appropriately placing police where they should be, responding to crime.
Yep.
Not domestic situations, mental health crisis, homelessness. So defunding police is about reappropriating funds and maybe creating other avenues and other resources to address these other things that should not fall under the umbrella of policing.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, I grew up in New York City and I've lived in San Diego and I've lived other places, and I'm going to assume not much different than in other places. Those decisions around policing, police departments, and how those funding is about the mayor. And again, we're talking about elected officials.
That's it.
And if at some point we want to look at things like police reform or some other, positive promoting things in our community, we have to think about who are we electing, what are their positions, and what are they going to do?
That's it. Yep. I love both of those examples, Henri. I just think that they're ones that we can all connect to, and I think that's really important. So let's talk then about let's kind of shift a little bit, not that we're not already there some, but this idea of then how do we inform our voice, right? If our listeners are gaining a better understanding of how critical these local elections are going to be, let's talk then about how they'll get informed. Henri already mentioned this because I mentioned my ballot to them earlier, so I'll share it with you all here. On my ballot here in San Diego, I have 2 federal positions I have to vote for, 2 state level offices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 county level offices, to include everything from board of supervisors, a superior court judge. We've been talking a lot about those roles, community college district trustees, my local school board, and then even more local than that, our mayor and our city attorney. And so, yeah, I can be honest and say, I look at most of these and go, have no idea who any of these people are. The most I've seen about them are the little postcards I get in my mailbox, and I know well enough to know that the postcard is not the place I need to go for my information. So I have a lot of work to do before myself. Melissa said, and Henri both said the sacrifice, and Henri said the sacrifice, and Melissa said, how can we not, basically, right? What better thing to sacrifice our time for than to be well informed for an election, any election, and especially this one. So I have a lot of homework to do, right? Because for the majority of these, I know nothing about anyone, and I have to learn about them before I'm going to be able to vote for them in a way that is going to perhaps have a positive impact on not just my day-to-day life, of course, but the day-to-day life of our community. So it can seem overwhelming. And so ensuring first and foremost that the first time you see all this is not when you open your ballot or step up to a voting booth is going to be really critical, right? Melissa mentioned how, it's easy if you're going in person and you're going to that booth and you pull up that screen and you have 27 things, because by the way, I didn't mention all the propositions, and I do have about 20 propositions that we have to vote for, that it's real easy to get caught up in, well, let me just vote for president and maybe my senator, and the rest of it's going to be like, like I used to take multiple choice tests as a kid, right? Cover my eyes and bubble in letter C or whatever. So let's talk about where can folks go, right? Right now, Henri, as they're thinking about informing themselves in order to be well prepared to vote so that they can do it in a way that's thoughtful and not hasty. What are some resources we want to send them to?
Yeah, this is an interesting thought, and if I may, before I
Please
answer that question,
do it.
I just thought of an anecdote.
Yeah.
So this past week, I spent the week taking care of my 5-year-old grandson. Which, oh my goodness, I cannot tell you what it's like under this pandemic to deal with school.
Oh gosh, yeah.
A kindergartner and trying to focus online.
Oh yeah.
At least, thank goodness, there's some in-class time.
Yeah.
But I also had an opportunity to watch my daughter, the teacher, trying to teach her 4th grade class remotely, and never met one student physically yet.
Yep.
It's just incredible. But anyway, that's not the anecdote. As I was chatting with her, I asked her about her partner, and was he registered to vote? And she laughed at me. She says, "Look, there's just nobody coming into this family who doesn't vote." and as we started to talk more about it, and it just dawned on me. She said, "Dad, think about it. From the day any of us, our earliest memories, we went with you to the booth." And I thought about that.
Love that.
And so where does this all start?
Yep.
It starts with taking your kids when you go to vote. And that's something I always remember, my kids going with me to vote and using that as a teachable moment to explain why we do that, what are the implications of doing that. So thank God they didn't go through what I went through in their 18, early 20s with, we don't understand this, so we're only voting for presidential election. So I just think modeling the behavior of voting and the importance of that behavior to your kids, is a good start.
So putting it in the language.
A little anecdote.
No, I love that. But putting it in the language of our topic here, which is using your informed voice, right? What you're talking about is that part of that, when we start to inform our voices, starts very little. It starts as little as being able to understand, I'm with mom or dad or grandpa or whoever it is standing in front of a voting booth. Go ahead, Melissa.
I've got to say, it's not even as deep as that. My nephew is watching YouTube, and these ads are popping up. So he's 10, and he's walking around saying things like, "My name is Nigel, and I endorse this message." Because that's what's being shown to them on YouTube.
Yeah.
And so, he's asked me, "Well, Auntie, are you voting for XYZ?" And so he's reiterated things that I know not to be true.
Yep.
And I've had to explain to him that, just because it's on an ad on YouTube doesn't make it true. Here's what's true, mm-hmm. or here's how you can mm-hmm. go look it up, because kids these days, even at 10, are probably better at researching on YouTube and Google than most adults I know. So I show him, but you can't believe everything. So I think even just being very aware of what they're exposed to at such an early age. I mean, there have even been instances where teachers are making comments in these Zoom meetings, making political references or, throwing little support in for their candidates. And so we have to make sure that we're aware of what our children are aware of, and then countering what they're hearing with fact and not just what might be thrown their way.
See, I love it. I love this.
Oh, sorry.
No, go, Henri, go.
You know what I loved about what you said was that I grew up in that era, late 60s or 70s, question authority. And so, and that did mean, in a mean spirit, adversarial way, more than, okay, I hear what you're saying. Let me go see what I can learn, or let me check out. Let me check out the facts. And so I agree with you. It's such a wonderful moment that you can have those conversations and redirect them to, well, that may not necessarily be true, but here's a place where you can go and do some research and find out on your own, which I think is more powerful than us telling you, no, that's not it. It should be like this.
Exactly.
That's huge. I just love that you introduced, Henri, this idea of how we're helping our kids get informed voices even at a young age. And Melissa, the way you expanded on it is beautiful, because and let's be clear. The more we're teaching someone, we all know, well, I shouldn't say that, I'm an educator, but it's generally understood that if you can teach someone else, then you understand it at a deeper level. So when you think in terms of, we're about to ask you to go do some research and do your homework and be well informed when you actually vote, especially at the local level coming up. Imagine if you did that side by side, right, with a child in your life, right? And if they're Melissa's 10-year-old godson and can navigate the internet, maybe he's the one doing the research and presenting to you, right? Because now he's gonna find things that you might not find, and vice versa. Or maybe you're going to have a little competition and you're both going to kind of go find, and then you're going to come back together. And if they're younger, then you're just going to talk about it, and you're going to your point, Henri, as you said earlier, you're going to model, right, what to do. So let's talk then in our little bit of time that we have left about where.
Well, I do want to come back to resources, like you.
Yeah. That's exactly where we're going to go next. So let's go there. Let's go there next, because that's where we want to kind of take our conversation as we're coming to the end of it, because having creating something that's actionable for folks is always an intention with our episodes on this podcast. So let's talk about where people can go and how they can between now and November, November 3rd, become more informed around their local elections. Henri, what are you thinking?
So in terms of resources, places that I've gone is vote.org, indivisible.org, When We All Vote. And the vote.org, the thing I like about there is, and let me segue a minute. We are, 2-3 weeks away from the election?
Yep.
And I think some people may have a false sense of confidence that they're registered, and they may not be registered. And I know these podcasts go across states, so every state is different. And where some people, and I don't know this to be true, may still have the option to register, some may not, given where they live. I know there's been attempts to extend that because of COVID and mailing issues, and appears that that's not always going through everywhere. So vote.org is a resource I believe you can go to actually check your registration, where you can put in your name, your location, and they will actually tell you whether or not you are registered or not. And like I said, depending on the state you live in, you can maybe explore what options you may have available to you if that was the case, that you weren't registered. The other thing I think is important is, and this is something I'm learning as I'm trying to get as much information about the differences. Depending on where you live, you may want to check what are the requirements of voting. I'm hearing in some states the mail-in ballot has to be witnessed by a signature of someone, not necessarily notarized, but it has to be witnessed.
Right.
If that is not done, your ballot goes into the garbage.
Yeah.
So when we talk about resources, it's nice. It's good there are resources to go to check on registration, to maybe get information about voting processes. But what I'm also hearing, it is very important to pay attention to your particular state's rules process in terms of voting by mail or any of these processes outside of in-person voting, because they are literally throwing out ballots for very little things like, the signature wasn't on the right line, or you didn't have the co-signature of the witness. And oh my goodness,
Sure.
We need every vote to count.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I appreciate you kind of reminding us of that, and I feel like every day we turn on the news and there's a story along those lines, right? And so I think that the main point for all of us to take away from that is it's really important, if you haven't already, to go to your state guidelines and be very clear about what is expected, whether you're mailing it in, whether you're dropping it off like we can here in California as well, whether you're voting in person. What do you have to bring with you? What has to happen for it to be considered official and for it to vote and for it to count, right? Especially if you're going to do all the homework that we're talking about now. Henri's given us.
Go ahead, Melissa. It's important to state also that when we talk about being prepared, we're not just talking about mentally prepared or having the knowledge, which is indeed important, but you need to be prepared to possibly stand in long lines.
Yes.
To possibly deal with any intimidation. I've been seeing lots of stories where there have been, for whatever side, gatherings, which people have to literally walk through in order to vote. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared for the fact that, if you decide to wear your party shirt, whoever you're voting for, that you may get some comments or some ugliness from people. It's a very charged election. So I think being prepared all the way around, if Absolutely. It's going to require you standing in line, is your job going to give you time off to vote? And if not, are you going to go beforehand or go after? Having that all mapped out. And if you think maybe I'm going to be in a line, stick a couple of granola bars in your pocket.
Absolutely.
Whatever it's going to take for you to stick it out and vote, because I think that's another thing that some people are banking on, is that people aren't going to want to stand in lines and they're just going to say, forget it and go home. Yeah. We don't want to be those people.
Yep.
So we want to make sure that, I really hope it doesn't. So I'm telling people to be totally prepared when you go there, that you may be in long lines, you may face opposition, you may, need to take a bottle of water and a snack. But if you're dedicated to getting it done, make that game plan beforehand.
Melissa, you make such a great point, because I always think that, you want to prepare, and depending on where you live and already knowing the probability, yes, one should go have a couple bottles of water, maybe bring a book, if you're elderly, maybe something you can sit on possibly. I know some places people are volunteering to stand in line for folks.
Yep.
When we talk about what are things we can do, locally, people are actually organizing things like give a ride to someone.
Yep.
I will stand in line for you. I will hand out maybe water, things like that. But I think what is so key is what you said, Melissa, be prepared.
Yeah.
Be prepared that I may have to be in line a few hours. I may be hot. I may get wet. I may be hungry. How do I prepare for that? Because you're right. At the end of the day, the only reason for the long line is they don't want you to vote. And there's no reason for that. But just prepare.
But we know what happens. So,
and one thing, let me just throw this in real quick. Another thing that at least we're doing here locally and promoting is early voting.
Yes.
And so, because trust me, we all know that dilemma of voting on Tuesday, long lines, work. Early voting allows you to vote on weekends. I think New York starts this weekend coming, Saturday and Sundays, where you don't have to deal with taking time off from work and possibly avoiding some of the long lines.
Yeah.
So those are other options. And also, when we talk about being informed, you're in California. We just read about they're putting up fake boxes to collect ballots.
Yep.
I mean, so we need to be informed.
Yeah. Well, and let's, as we kind of start to wrap this up, you all have made a couple of powerful points that I'm just going to reiterate as a way of wrapping this up. And the example you just gave that's embarrassing as anything, Henri, is one of them. And that is this idea that the fake, ballot boxes are going up. Because here in California, everybody gets their ballot by mail, and you're encouraged to submit it that way or to drop it off at a polling place. Or you do have the option to vote in person. There's like a 4-day window, I think, where folks can vote in person. But to your point, the being informed part, right? So I'm gonna kind of bring all this back around to what I heard you all say, and I'm gonna couch it this way: 2-part preparedness, right? Part 1 is doing your homework, taking a look at your ballot. You can see your ballot online if you're somebody who's going to walk in, right, to vote. You can pull up your ballot online. If you pull up your local state voter registration website, you can actually see the ballot online. If you query the town or the county that you live in, San Diego County voter information, if I query that, I can go right to a government agency who's going to give me all of the nonpartisan, non-biased information. Those are the sources you want to go to educate yourself about your candidates. So be prepared to vote thoughtfully and with some knowledge about who the people are that you're about to give the privilege to be in office. And then part 2 of preparedness is the basics that you all just talked about, the two of you just talked about, which is be ready to vote no matter what, right? Make sure that you're going to those legitimate sites to find out where to take your ballot, right? I would like to think nobody would walk by one of those fake boxes and go, oh, I'm supposed to put my ballot there. I can go online and find out exactly where I'm supposed to take my ballot in this county. And absolutely, I shouldn't be taking it anywhere else. But also to Melissa's points, be prepared, right? It could be a long day. You could need snacks. You could need water. We want to be the folks who say we will be prepared to vote and our voice will be heard. And it doesn't matter what obstacles that get thrown up at us. We are going to vote, right? Because it matters. It matters at every level. It matters, yes, with that presidential election, but as we focused our comments on mostly today, it matters at every level. Every single dot I circle in on my ballot is going to influence my day-to-day living. Every single circle. So how am I going to make sure that the results of that have the positive impact on my day-to-day for myself and my community? That's what we're looking for. All right, you guys, final thoughts. I'm going to go first to you, Henri, and then Melissa, you get the final thought of the day. You're going to wrap it up, girl. Henri, final thought for folks?
Well, something you just said made me and we said this, I'll be brief, is yes, we have this massive presidential election going on. And I've listened to people's thoughts and let's just say, for example, it may not be the candidate you fully want, and I've listened to, in terms of Biden as an example, he represents some of the things I like, but not all the things I like, right. And I get that. And to me, that's where the importance of these ongoing elections comes into play, because the things that are going to influence that is who gets into the House and who gets into the Senate. And, who are you going to elect to really maybe then push forward some of the things that you truly want to see happening in terms of the people that you elected in office. So I think it's just so important to, yes, vote. This is a presidential election, but think about the ongoing elections that are equally important in terms of what happens to you locally in your own community and how you can influence what happens on the federal level.
I love that so much. So no matter what happens with this presidential election, remember that the election next year is going to have as much, if not more, influence on your day to day as the next election that comes up in 4 years. Thank you for that. Melissa, what you got for us? Wrap it up, friend.
I think the thing I would probably want to reiterate most is this idea that people have that their vote doesn't count. I want to just kind of get the message across that you have more power than you may realize, and that power lies in your knowledge. And so if you really feel, if you're one of those people listening, or if you have had conversations with people who have said, well, I'm not going to vote because it doesn't make a difference, I would encourage you to encourage them to do the research. If they do the research and see exactly how their vote impacts, especially these local elections, even if they feel that way about the presidential election as a result of the electoral college and all of that, completely understand. But these local elections, there is no electoral college. And so you do have the ability to change not only life for yourself, but for those that you love, as we talked about earlier, and for those coming after us, for our future generations, for our children and our children's children, and to just have a defeatist attitude, to feel like it doesn't matter, so I'm not going to do anything anyway. I would only wrap up by saying, if you do nothing, then you know for certain nothing changes.
Yeah.
If you do something, then at least there's a chance, and at least you're trying. And I don't want anyone to give up, especially in times like these, where it is a little more difficult to keep pushing. So I would say, that old cliche saying, knowledge really is power.
Yeah.
And it's power that thankfully, due to technology, is at your fingertips. Yep. It's in your pocket every day, on that cell phone that you're walking around with. Google is our friend. And it doesn't even require that you know exactly what to look for. You type in South Carolina voter information and boom, you're going to get all this, Yep. So I would just implore people to take advantage of that and to arm themselves with the most powerful weapon we have, which is the knowledge.
I love it. So knowledge is power. Knowledge is what's going to arm you to make those informed choices and therefore be using your informed voice. Melissa, Henri, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And when you say power, it just makes me think about, if voting wasn't such a powerful and influential thing, they wouldn't work so hard to suppress your vote.
Amen. Amen. I love that. That's a great way to wrap it. Thank you, Henri.